Hello, thank you for joining our presentation. It's called Sociolinguistics, Forensic Phonetics, and Contemporary Artistic Practices, an interdisciplinary analysis of voice as evidence. We are Mateusz Pietraszek and Maribel Castro Díaz, and in this talk, Mateusz and I will address the intersection between contemporary art and linguistic analysis, focusing on how the voice, and particularly the accent, can operate simultaneously as aesthetic material and as a form of evidence. This is an interdisciplinary project combining artistic research, sociolinguistics, and forensic phonetics. In the video, I will introduce the artistic and cultural framework, and Mateusz will continue with the linguistic components and their application to the work of Lawrence Abu Amdam.
Just to start with a little bit of context, It is estimated that nowadays there are around 6,000 to 7,000 languages spoken, so the variety is huge. You can see here in this infographic the most linguistically diverse countries, and if we just zoom in a little bit, you're going to see that there are countries such as India, for example, with 500 languages, Papua New Guinea, just 9 million people, but 840 languages. So, we should keep in mind that bilingualism is present in practically every country in the world. It's estimated that more than half of the world's population is bilingual at this moment. Around 40% would be bilingual, the remainder would be multilingual, so even more languages would be involved. And those languages that those people speak also have dialects, sociolects, and idiolects, so the situation is fairly complex. At the same time, there are around 120 million people who've been forcibly displaced around the world, so they don't live where they would like to be living at the moment, and 36 million people might be considered refugees.
Over the past decades, contemporary art has evolved into a deeply hybrid and interdisciplinary field. Nowadays, art no longer restricts itself to traditional media, but actively incorporates languages, tools, and research methodologies from other domains such as science, technology, law, and of course, linguistics. So, contemporary art today is fundamentally interdisciplinary. Artists work across science, technology, humanities, and social research. Also, art not only represents but produces knowledge. Here I refer to the idea that art moves across different epistemologies, creating porous boundaries that allow artists to question culture and power. This means that art borrows freely between disciplines, opening up new ways to critique how discourses of culture and power work. This refers to Rancière's idea that interpretation is redistributed, meaning is no longer delivered from the artist to the viewer, but co-created. The viewer becomes an active interpreter rather than a passive receiver. Artists work with language and voice to reveal how accents, tone, and speech patterns are culturally coded, showing that the way we speak and the way that we are listened to is never neutral. Today, many contemporary artists work with language, sound, archives, and analytical methods. The voice is no longer something neutral or universal. It is deeply shaped by ideology, by listening practices, and by structures of inequality. And this is precisely why a dialogue with linguistic analysis becomes meaningful. So now Mateusz will explain how accents function, how voices are classified, and how they are evaluated or mistrusted, provides a framework to analyze artistic practices.
Thank you, Maribel. Now some insights from sociolinguistics. So what's in an accent? One of the key issues relevant to this presentation is monolingual bias, so this belief held by many Western people and scholars as well, that the prototypical human is seen as having only one language, which is related to standard language ideology, according to which I know variation in language is undesirable, but we shouldn't forget that, well, this bias toward an abstract and idealized homogeneous language is just a social construct, and normally it's the powerful people whose accent and variety become the standard. Some basic facts and myths about language variety. I would mention that, well, one of the most widespread myths related to standard language ideology is that standard accent or variety is better, but as I mentioned before, there is no linguistic reason to think so. Okay, just like no language is better than another, no variety or accent is better than another. Accent is just, the way people speak, and there's nothing good or bad about it. But it's true that if it's identified with stigmatized groups and their associated stereotypes, then obviously that may lead to discrimination and even accent stigmatization, which is, as you can see here, very common. Sorry about this. Some other basic facts and myths. Well, there are people with no accents. No, we all have an accent. We just tend to perceive our accent as, no accent. And then there is another myth which is very important it is quite relevant to this presentation, and that's the belief that accent is stable. However, that is also not true, because accent convergence can happen even within the domain of one conversation, and we always adjust our way of speaking to those people that we are speaking with. Accent is very much related with identity because it bears those social meanings, as we've seen. Okay, from an evolutionary and anthropological perspective, we could say that, well, it helped us to know who to cooperate with, who were our friends, who belonged to the same tribe, and as such, in our brains, it is a very powerful social categorization tool, and this categorization is an inevitable tendency of the human mind. So we just develop attitudes to other people based on their characteristics, and accent is one very important characteristic. As you can see here, this is a quote: "Accent is arguably the primary signal of socioeconomic status." Okay, so it gives you a lot of information about people. And if we take into account all those different functions of accent that you can see on the screen, well, no wonder that it can also lead to the distancing and othering of certain segments of the population. And there are plenty of studies in sociolinguistics dealing with accent bias and discrimination, some of which you can see are on this screen. And we all remember what this meme talks about. So moving on to forensic phonetics. Forensic science is basically the science that's supposed to that's supposed to help and aid justice. And one branch of forensic linguistics is forensic phonetics. Some of the functions of forensic phonetics when aiding justice professionals is speaker identification. For example, if you want to compare a suspect and a culprit based on their so that's forensic speaker comparison based on their speech characteristics. But what's more interesting from the point of view of this presentation is speaker profiling or analysis. So just based on speech, you try to figure out whether, where a person might be from. You do it by analyzing vowels, consonants, obviously with broad knowledge of accent and dialect features related to, the language varieties that you're dealing with. And here you can see an example of the spectrogram of the word leave. And here you can see the vowels E, U, and R with the formants marked down here. The artist that we're going to talk about later on uses spectrograms, although not in the works that we're going to comment on today. And just to finish this section, a little example of forensic speaker comparison between an anonymous caller and a suspect. So, for example, by comparing the pronunciation of the vowel in home, whether it's home or home, you can determine the likelihood of the two being the same person.
Lawrence Abu Amdam, winner of the 2019 Turner Prize, is an artisan sound researcher whose work explores what he calls the politics of listening. He examines how acoustic technologies, voice analysis, and listening practices operate in contexts of conflict, justice, and human rights. And through the voice, he addresses urgent issues of our present: migration, borders, human rights, state surveillance, legal testimony, and linguistic identity. Critics often describe Abu Hamdam as a private ear or forensic listener because he combines artistic inquiry with methods taken from acoustic analysis and forensic audio investigation. He represents this new type of artist researcher working within what Ito Steyr has called forensic aesthetics, where sensory evidence and data become critical images.
Thank you, Maribel, for this introduction to the artist. So the first piece that we're going to deal with is The Freedom of Speech itself from 2012, which is a mixed media installation comprising a stereo audio documentary and an acoustic foam sculpture. Now, this foam sculpture represents the voice prints that illustrate the frequency and amplitude, so some acoustic properties of two different voices pronouncing the word you. And in the audio documentary, we've got testimonies from linguists, asylum seekers, lawyers, and officials. The problem dealt with by Abu Hamdan is a situation in which an asylum seeker says that they're from a country and specialists try to determine where they come from to detect whether those people represent their origin accurately to get asylum. Now, this is hugely problematized in the audio documentary because, as we've seen, accents are not stable, which may even lead, and it has led to wrongful, to people being wrongfully deported. Very often those analyses are done by private companies. We don't know who is behind them exactly, and well, there might be some unqualified people employed there, and also people from the Western countries with a huge monolingual bias. And those decisions that they make when they decide whether the person is from the place that they report to be from are based on single sounds, like, for example, the famous difference in English between tomato and tomato. And this is actually one of the word banadora, which means tomato in Arabic, which may be pronounced differently depending on the accent, is one of the examples mentioned in the documentary itself. Besides those interviews, as those companies conduct them remotely, miss a lot of information which is relevant in communication, and thus those high-stake decisions about people's future are made with insufficient evidence and unwarranted certainty. So some of the issues raised by this artwork are the following. So what's the legal status of our voices? How should our voices align with citizenship? They obviously shouldn't, because we've seen that citizenship should not be determined through voice, as our accents converge and they are not stable. And thus voice should not be binding, and it should definitely not delimit borders. The artist also distinguishes between bad listening and good listening practices. Bad listening is just focusing on single features or one single feature of somebody's voice without listening to the whole background, and that's to the whole background of the person, which has been shaped by their story, by the migration story as well, which we're going to see in the next piece in more detail. This obviously brings to mind the famous biblical story of the word shibboleth. Shibboleth is a word that in English means a word or phrase by which you can recognize where somebody is from, and there was this conflict between two different tribes, the Gileadites and Ephraimites, and basically I think it was Gileadites who made people, in order to find out whether they were from the same tribe, they made them pronounce the word shibboleth, and when that word was pronounced as sibboleth, as you can see here, by the Ephraimites, then they knew that they were not their friends, that they were enemies. And you can see the whole story here, so if you want to pause, this is a passage from the Bible. In the audio recording from Abu Hamdan's piece, we can see some examples of monolingual and monoaccentual bias in this conversation between, the interviewer and a person who speaks with a perfect American accent, although their story is, quite unexpected because they were born in Dubai, and the Palestinian from a refugee camp in Lebanon. So you can see, you can end up speaking with an American accent, and the person here reports that they basically learnt it off television. Now, the second piece that I would like to talk about today is called conflicted phonemes. Phonemes, by the way, are the smallest units of language whose purpose is to distinguish between meanings of words, but we're not going to get into too much detail. As you can see, It consists of vinyl wall prints. We've got this print, more about it in a moment. And then we've got these little prints and some takeaway A4 sheets for the audience. So the problem here is a situation which is similar to the one in the previous work. There were 12 Somali migrants that the artist chose for this project whose asylum applications were rejected based on accents in the Netherlands. And the artistic representation of the problem consists of this timeline that we're going to talk about in a moment and of their individual voice maps. Well, the context and the background is quite important here because the Somali language was standardized in the 1970s, but this was followed by very complex historical developments and events, which resulted in the mixing of plenty of dialects and varieties, as a result of mass migrations, and it has led to a huge level of hybridization of the language. So on this vinyl, we can see a representation of the timeline of the Somali language, which here you can see when it was first standardized, and then all the different events and the mixings of varieties and the mixings of people are represented in this way by Jana Ulrich, who collaborated with Abu Hamdan on this work. And here you can see an artistic representation of those application forms, asylum application forms, which were rejected based on accent, which, well, you can see some of the details here. And those are followed by those A4 takeaway sheets that represent the linguistic biographies and backgrounds, they're called voice maps, of those speakers. The speaker is here, and you can see all the different types of people that they speak to and the languages that they use. So you can see that there is a wide variety present. And that variety inevitably, leads to variation in their language, to a huge diversity of the varieties they end up speaking are hybrid varieties. So Abu Hamdan says that this accent object, or the linguistic data, should also be heard as a story in itself, one that could reveal an account just as traumatic. Again, it's a biography of migration more than anything else, and we should not just determine where people are from to grant them asylum or not based on one or two accent features. So to sum up, linguistic research is descriptive and it cannot appeal to emotions the way art does. The artist draws on linguistics both aesthetically and ethically while using elements of phonetics, applied linguistics. He also questions and challenges some of the practices without being very too critical of linguists. He's critical of the use of fragmented science for political purposes, basically. And the works reflect topics dealt with in linguistics, such as language ideology topics, the lack of recognition of natural language variety. It also deals with language's identity. Can accents actually determine citizenship? And that is questioned. And obviously there is a lot of content here to do with linguistic discrimination of all sorts.
So, to conclude, our research highlights how the voice has become an important political territory where issues of identity, legitimacy, and power are negotiated. By bringing together contemporary art, sociolinguistics, and forensic phonetics, we show how listening itself can become a critical practice, capable of exposing inequalities embedded in the ways voices are classified, measured, or believed. Our interdisciplinary approach demonstrates that artistic practices can offer new insights into how evidence is constructed, how accents are perceived, and how the voice can be resignified as a form of resistance. Here is a selection of references, and thank you very much for your attention.